joined by Bruno Tertrais. Bruno Tertrais is the Deputy Director of the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique, a think tank based in France. Also just published the new Spanish edition of his new book, La Guerra de los Mundos. So it's a very timely moment to discuss everything related to global geopolitics, but also in particular the future of war, which is the topic that we'll be covering extensively in this conversation as part of our international yearbook. So Bruno, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure
Glad
to have you in Barcelona.
Thank you.
So the first thing that I would like to start with is this idea that you described as the time of predators, right? It seems that global geopolitics is going an era where very powerful actors aim to defend their spheres of influence, and a lot of times doing it with the use of force or the threat of the use of force. How would you describe the current geopolitical landscape we're living in?
Well, let me start with a very simple idea. There is always this expectation that the old order is dead and we're waiting for a new order to emerge, and that we're living in a transition period. That's something you find, you read and hear a lot. But what if there was no new order? Assuming there was an old order, what if there was no new order? What if this transition lasted decades? I think it's a high possibility. So my first point is that we should not wait for something new to emerge. We have to make the best of what the world is today. Use the word predators. I think that since the election of Donald Trump, it's a very appropriate expression, because we knew that Russia, China, to a certain extent, Turkey, Iran maybe, but we're acting like predators on the global stage, that is, not upholding all the international norms, and most importantly, being willing to extend their reach, their territory by force. Now, comes Donald Trump, and then suddenly you realize that there's a new predator in the courtyard. That is, it seems that Donald Trump is acting just like Russia and China are, that is, extending their willingness to extend the US territory, including by force if necessary. Remember what he said about Greenland. He's not ruling out the use of military force. So I think that's a very important thing. Will the United States act like just another predator, or will it get back to its senses, so to say, at some point, whether under Trump or afterward? I think this is critical for us Europeans, because we're not predators. We are slowly learning to act in a world where force and might are actually as important, if not more important, than international norms and laws. But whether or not the US will act that way is something which is very important for the future of Europe.
Mm-hmm. Tell me a bit about Europe. You said, rightly so, we are not predators.
We are no longer predators.
No longer. We used to be, exactly, but since we abandoned our more aggressive attitude toward other actors centuries ago, we've characterized ourselves as an area of peace, not only internally, but also fostering peace, cooperation, dialogue, diplomacy, as the normal state of global politics, right? And that was our role, to influence through our internal way of conceiving Europe, and the European Union in particular, also aiming to export that to a sense and to the rest of the world. Is this the idea still valid? Are we still capable, or should we still pursue that goal?
Look, I think it's still relevant to some extent. First of all, as you said, we conceived Europe as a peace project, peace inside Europe, and that's something we always need to remind the younger generations, because they don't necessarily know about the fact that it's a huge historical success to have a Europe at peace. Now, when I say Europe, don't get me wrong, I'm talking about the EU, broadly speaking. Of course, there are wars outside the EU, but the European integration project was meant first and foremost as a peace project inside. And that's an acquis. And we need to nurture it, and we can be proud of it because it's still relevant. No wars on the mainland, on the main part of the European continent for more than 80 years, that's an extraordinary achievement. Now, are we still able, does it still make sense to be a model or an example for the rest of the world? I would say the following. I think we've been too naive. We've been too naive as Europeans to believe that just by setting an example, the world would naturally follow, okay? But that's not a reason to completely change our software, our intellectual and political software. We need to keep the faith, so to say, because if we Europeans do not maintain a modicum of respect for international norms, for the international law, for normal trade between nations, etc., then who will? Then who will? So I think we have to abandon our naivete, but we cannot completely forget our ideals, so to say. So we have to be a bit more realistic, but not completely change our very nature, our political DNA.
Yeah. How feasible is that when the two main powers, and I mean the US and China, are engaging in an ever more sort of confrontational, if not direct confrontation, at least global confrontation for what some have characterized as a new Cold War or new bipolarity on very different terms, but still a world reigned by two main powers. Is this the picture that you agree that the world is undergoing?
Look, I used to think 10 years ago that we were not in a new Cold War, but I've changed my mind.
Okay.
I think that the US-China showdown is increasingly showing the signs of being something that resembles very much the Cold War. But it's different. It's different because, one, China is the equal of the United States from an economic standpoint. The Soviet Union was an economic dwarf. Okay, so that changes the picture. Second difference, there is still today an interdependence between China and the United States, despite the attempts at decoupling the economies of both countries. And we're not going to completely, this is not going to completely disappear, okay? And economic interdependence still acts like a brake to direct military war between the two. So that's among the differences between what resembles the Cold War. I call it the lukewarm war, just to make sure that you don't confuse it with the Cold War. But it's not completely incorrect to say that this resembles increasingly the new Cold War. There's another difference, an important one. You don't have clear military blocs, okay? You have what I call two families, a family of more or less democratic, more or less liberal countries, and a family of autocratic countries, including the neo-imperial powers that we talked about. Families, that means that they're not as discrete blocks as they were during the Cold War. China has no military allies, except for North Korea, at least on paper.
Yeah.
So that's one big difference. The US, on paper also, still has 3,000, 4,000 formal allies. So in a nutshell, it looks like a new Cold War, but we should not think that we should reproduce the exact template of the Cold War. What does it mean for us Europeans? I think we have to, not forgetting who we are and what we stand for, we have to add a component to the way we project power abroad, and that's the military component. If we are not a credible military actor without the United States, that is on our own, we will not be taken seriously. And in a sense, Mr. Trump is giving us a favor because he has pushed us towards increasing our own national defense spending, which I think is a good strategy, even though the objectives set up at the NATO summit may be a bit too ambitious.
Mm. And with the Trump factor, to also link with these broader geopolitical developments, should Europe get closer to China? Is that a good strategy?
It depends on what, okay? I think there's a myth that sometimes you read or hear about, which is the idea that because the US is more or less moving away, at least temporarily from us, we have to get closer as a matter of balance to China. So let's be very clear. China is a strategic adversary of Europe. we can cooperate with China on some aspects of international life, but you cannot balance the United States with China. Let's not forget that China has been acting as a predator on the European territory in each and every aspect of economic life, or scientific life, or intellectual life. Let's not forget that China has ordered its citizens in 2017 to spy for the government anytime they are abroad. I'm not saying that every Chinese citizen in Spain or in France is a spy, but we should not forget that this is a system which is absolutely no longer what it was 30 years ago. It's a very aggressive competitor. Now, on one point, Europe has a choice to make. And I don't know which one is the best. It's not for me to say. We can either accelerate the green transition or accelerate what I call our geopolitical transition, being more autonomous. But you can't have both at the same time. Why? Because the only way we can accelerate the green transition is to buy Chinese parts, Chinese batteries, Chinese cars, Chinese solar panels, etc. There is no alternative today, and probably not for the next 10 years. So I think that's the way I like to put it to European leaders. It's a choice, but you can't do both. We can all have our preferences as citizens, as analysts, but we won't be able to do both.
Let me bring you to another dimension of current global affairs, which is, in addition to this increasing geopolitical rivalry, the understanding of this world being increasingly driven by conflict, right? We are still in the midst of the Ukraine war. We see strong destabilization in the Middle East, including the war in Gaza, but also between Israel and Iran, with the bombings of the United States in Iran as well, the possibility this becoming regional destabilization factor. But also, let's not forget, in Africa, the number of conflicts and the humanitarian consequences of those conflicts still being at a very high peak when it comes to the conflictivity around the world. So is this world becoming or more conflictual than we thought, or I'm sure of what we desire?
Yeah. Well, I think you really have two different dimensions here. First, the statistics. The world is not getting increasingly violent. The number of real wars, military wars, classic state-to-state war is not increasing. There's a slight increase of political violence overall over the past 15 years, but that's because of terrorism, okay? So it depends, it literally depends on how you how you measure conflict. Generally, it's by the number of casualties, okay? But there is no increase in the number of classic state-to-state, interstate war. For instance, this year, or at least in 2024, because we just got the statistics for 24, it's 4 major wars between states, just 4. Now, the second dimension is that whatever the numbers, there are some wars, currently at least 2, which have a global impact for various reasons. Because of the importance of the norms they violate, in particular the Ukraine war. It's always useful to remind people that a permanent member of the UN Security Council gaining territory by force is something that not only we were now no longer supposed to see in Europe, but that's a taboo in the world. It has been one at least since the mid-70s. So, and that's the first part. Second part is, of course, the economic ramifications. Remember that the global food and agricultural markets were in turmoil because of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So that's at least 2 reasons why the Ukraine war is very important, not only for us Europeans, but for the world in general. It's also a very deadly war. According to the Ukrainians, and I'm not saying that their numbers are not inflated, but at least it's a very high number. There is now more than 1 million dead and wounded, mostly wounded, and 1 million casualties on the Russian side, and probably several 100,000 on the Ukrainian side. This is even by the standards of our own conflicts of the past 80 years, this is a very, very deadly conflict. So that's the third reason why the Ukraine war matters, maybe more than other conflicts. But again, the number of dead people, how you measure a war, does not mean much in terms of visibility. The biggest conflict, the most important conflict in terms of casualties in 22 and 23 was in Tigray, Ethiopia. So most people in Europe have never heard of Tigray, okay? So bottom line, some conflicts matter more than others, not because of the high number of casualties, but because of their resonance throughout the world. And that's also true for the conflicts in the Middle East.
Tell me a bit about those. Do you see the prospects of escalation in the region or further?
Oh, you're talking about the Middle East?
The Middle East, yeah.
I think we are approaching the end of a sequence that started on October the 8th, 2023. That sequence can be characterized as one country, Israel, being so fed up with the aggressions it faced against its people, its population, its civilians, that it has sought to do something historic, that is reduce the threat it faces from non-state and state actors to a minimum. Now, this is what they've done vis-a-vis Hamas, what they've done vis-a-vis Hezbollah, and now what they're doing vis-a-vis Iran. Now, the Israelis have an expression which is cutting the head of the snake. The head of the snake allegedly is Tehran. So whatever happens next to Iran, the Islamic Republic will be weakened and will probably be less able and perhaps less willing to attack or support attack against Israeli interests. So that's the end of a sequence. Does this mean a more stable Middle East? I'm not sure at all. I'm not sure at all. By the way, I'm not sure when the Middle East has ever been stable anyway. So the idea of producing stability is unfortunately the norm in the Middle East. So the end of a sequence, but what happens afterwards is still unclear.
Are there any prospects for establishing some limits to this strategic goal of cutting the snake's head, right? I mean, whatever happens in between also has resonance in the rest of the Arab world.
Yes.
It can further and fosters instability also in the region, and we see many countries in the region very unhappy about the way regional politics is undergoing. Do you see any prospect for change on this?
You are absolutely right about the reactions of most Arab countries. Let me add, however, that in private, they are not completely unhappy about what's happening to the Islamic Republic of Iran, that many of them see as an adversary. I think that only one country can moderate the instincts of Israel, and that's the United States, obviously. And I think that given the very close partnership on defense and security that they have, Mr. Trump does have some influence on the Israeli government. It cannot say, you will do this or will not do that, but it does have some influence. And the good thing with Mr. Trump is that he doesn't like wars, because wars are not good for business. He prefers peace. So, for instance, trying to push the Israeli government towards accepting a deal in the form of a ceasefire plus some hostage deal with Hamas, that's something the US is pushing for. When I said that this was the end of a sequence, that also means that the Israel will have to continue dealing with Gaza. Now, I don't know what their final intentions are, and I'm not sure the Israeli government really has a game plan for what happens next. They sometimes nurture the illusion that you can forget about the population of Gaza and that they will leave for other Arab countries. This is farcical. This is meaningless. Now, the fact is that Israel will still have to have a population of 1.5 million at least Gazans who will either go back to destroyed cities or be left in a limbo, and Israel cannot afford that. Some in Israel know that. They are already working with Saudi Arabia and other countries for the reconstruction. They would love to see the Palestinian authorities taking charge, but this is not where we are today. So unfortunately, the situation in Gaza will continue to attract political attention around the world, and the humanitarian situation is barely getting better. So Gaza will still be in the news in the coming months.
We've discussed up till now some sort of what we would say the classical ways of understanding conflict. Of course, a great power competition and the prospects for great conflict between the big powers. Also territorial conflict when it comes to Ukraine, the humanitarian dimensions of conflict when it comes to Gaza. I would like to inquire you now about the future of war, because conflict in a general sense, and also war, also includes all sort of other dimensions, right? We see cyber wars, we see trade wars, we see guerrilla war, we see all sort of ways of understanding conflict and war becoming much more complex as a phenomenon than it used to be perhaps in the past. How do you assess the evolution of war?
I think you have to distinguish between war and conflict. You've been using two different words. You have to define terms if you want to talk about their future.
Let's focus on war now.
Yeah, if we focus on war, I would say that this is the direct application of force for political purposes. At least that's one major component of war. Trade wars are not real wars, or you end up, it's conflict, but it's not war. I think the use of military force is, at the end of the day, what defines war. So cyber is now part of the military. And here's the thing. Over the past 2 millennia, the layers of war have been multiplying, adding to each other without the others disappearing. Let me explain. War started on land, then on sea, then in the air, then in outer space, then in cyber. These different layers add one another. They do not, obviously, as we can see in Ukraine, fortunately, it does not make traditional, First World War type disappear. So war is getting more complex for this particular reasons. That is, at least 5 different areas of conflict, bearing in mind that cyber is now an area of almost constant conflict. And I'm referring to cyber as a military tool, not as a tool for, extortion or anything. So that's I think is an important aspect of your question. Second aspect, war is not disappearing, obviously, but it's not increasing, again, from a statistical standpoint. Right? 3, the major wars problem. Now, the major wars problem is one of the most interesting because something very strange has been happening in the world since 1945. We are now 80 years without a direct military conflict between the great powers of the moment. This is almost unprecedented. So I would say almost because some people say it depends how you count, etc. But let me put it this way. It's an exceptional duration of, not peace, but absence of direct military conflict between the great powers of the moment. So, 1, why? 2, will it continue to be the case? Why? Well, we've talked about economic interdependence. That may be one reason why war is less considered as a direct useful military instrument when you actually are in conflict with another great power. 2, there is a network of alliances, especially Western alliances, which make the big non-Western predators, that is Russia and China, less eager to consider, to contemplate the hypothesis of direct military conflict against a US ally. 3, and perhaps more importantly, there's nuclear deterrence. Nuclear weapons did not exist in 1914. Nuclear weapons did not exist in 1939, okay? So even though some are very quick to attribute directly this absence of direct military conflict between great powers only to nuclear weapons, I'm more cautious, but I'm saying it's very difficult to explain it without taking into account the existence of nuclear weapons, which make great powers a little bit less eager to consider the use of direct military force. So one last point, if I may, on the future of war in general, that is including civil conflict and internal wars. There is a very interesting dimension of the sociology of internal conflicts, which makes a connection between the population structure of a country and its propensity to civil war and internal conflict. Now, if I simplify it for our viewers, it's the number of young people in a society. If there is if you take a certain ratio between young people and dependent, that is the older and younger people, then you notice a correlation between the number of, between that population structure and the propensity to civil conflict. It's a complex phenomenon that I'm simplifying here. Now, why is it interesting? Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, has been the part of the world where war has been the most prevalent since 1945. But the population structure of Africa is changing. So you can actually project these population trends, and if the correlation I talked about remains the same, then we can anticipate that the likelihood of having all these internal domestic wars, conflict in Africa will diminish over time. It's a very, sorry for the long elaboration, but I think it's one of the few issues where you can make interesting positive projections about the future of conflict. Now, again, this is not a prediction. This is about the propensity of a society to
go to war. Yeah,
to go to war.
Absolutely. And let me ask you for the other side of the coin of war, which is defense, right? Then in view of these multiple ways of war and the different characteristics of today's war that you very rightly identified as being one over the other without disappearing the previous
Yes.
sort of territorial, more classical components of war, and adding up defense based on hybrid attacks and attacks on infrastructure. Or one could also say the instrumentalization of migrations, for instance, is also as a way of,
Absolutely.
of fostering
Yes.
insecurity, at least, if not war. What is the right formula on defense, and what should be the objectives for a core defense component of an international actor today? We are hearing these days a lot of emphasis on traditional defense expenditure, right? And you mentioned the NATO summit in The Hague, getting to this 5% target of defense divided in 3.5 and 1.5, but still overall 5% of GDP dedicated to defense issues. How would you characterize the main objectives or even if you like the main limitations of defense these days to face precisely the world you just described?
Look, several things here. First of all, Europeans have to face the prospect of a reduction of both the US presence in Europe and the US willingness to defend Europe. Therefore, it's logical that we take care more of ourselves in the defense field. However, what I'm concerned with is that we have the natural tendency to believe that the next war will be like the previous one, and that defending ourselves as Europeans means being able to face Russia without the United States, being able to face Russia in a direct military conflict. I'm not saying that Russia will never touch a EU or NATO member in Europe, but I think that we are focusing exceedingly on this. That is, we are focusing too much on classic military hardware and not enough, sometimes, on cyber and information operations and other less costly dimensions of conflict, not war, but conflict. So this focus on hardcore defense issues somewhat obfuscate the big question, which is for us, how do we instillate into the Kremlin the idea that Europe will be willing and able to protect and defend itself, okay? And that's something which is much bigger than just how do we react if Russian forces get into Estonia, for instance. Now, geography matters. This country, of course, is much less concerned, and that's understandable, with what's happening over there. Of course, if it's an EU member, NATO member, as France, as Spain, we have to be concerned with what happens to them, because we are all interdependent. But we are less immediately concerned with that scenario. However, geography matters less when you talk about cyber, when you talk about information operations, when you talk about the weaponization of migration and refugees, when you talk about undersea cables for communication, which Russia is likely to use to sabotage against us. So, in this respect, we're on the same big boat, despite our geography. Now, on the 5%, which is the target adopted by NATO, I'm quite perplexed by the fact that this commitment was made by all countries. Spain actually was one of the only ones who said this is not realistic. And may I say that I think the Spanish government was right on this? I think we Europeans have been submitting ourselves to Mr. Trump's desires too much. It's completely unrealistic to imagine that all European countries in 10 years from now will spend 5% of their GDP for defense and security. That is for military and other defense related. Mm-hmm. It's completely unrealistic. Most of them will not. Some of them will. Poland, the Baltic states, yes. France, I don't think so. Spain, I don't think so.
Even Italy, probably.
Italy, mm-hmm. Italy, certainly not. So I think this is like a comedy, okay? We agreed on paper to this huge increase in 10 years from now to make Mr. Trump happy. But this NATO summit was, I don't think it was the proudest moment of the transatlantic relation. Though, don't get me wrong, we do need to face a world which will be more dangerous for us Europeans and with less American support. Therefore, it is logical, it is necessary for us to increase our defense and security spending. But one, we have to be realistic about the targets, and two, we have to be wise and smart about the way we spend this money.
On this, probably one of the things that has not been sufficiently discussed in this summit, but also more generally, is integration, right, of that expenditure, and how you make sure that it's compatible, what you spend in one country with what you spend in another country, and that makes the total projection of force much more adequate to the goal that you are pursuing, right? And be that deterrence against Russia or these other sort of threats that you also mentioned, cyber or hybrid warfare. And on that, I would like to ask you on one thing that France has very strong role to play, which is on nuclear deterrence. You mentioned that before. There have been some inputs lately that France might be willing to start thinking about sharing the nuclear capabilities that it has if some sort of European framework is designed or it's put into motion so that others can benefit from that nuclear umbrella that France is able to provide, and many other European countries are not in a position to provide, and even more so if the United States is reluctant to provide that traditional nuclear umbrella. Where do you see the prospects for France really making that step forward in sharing those capabilities?
Okay, several points here. First, the French consider that given the growing integration between not only European neighbors, but European countries in general, there is the sense that what we call our vital interests, those which are covered by nuclear deterrence, are increasingly indistinguishable from one another. That is, imagine if Spain faced an existential threat one day in 20 years from now. I don't know the scenario, but obviously this would be a vital matter for France because you are a neighbor, an ally, a partner. Same for Italy, for Germany, probably increasingly for Poland too. So the successive French presidents have said that what we call the vital interest, that is the criteria for nuclear deterrence, they are increasingly Europeans. And Macron has gone one step further. It remains a game played by two actors, fundamentally. That is a president or prime minister with nuclear weapons and the adversary, Vladimir Putin. So what matters is how Putin views this. Okay. Now, if the United States maintains its nuclear commitment to NATO, there's no real reason to create a new European nuclear deterrence system. But if in 2 years from now, Mr. Trump says, you know what, I'm done with Europeans, and I'm, for instance, withdrawing all nuclear weapons from Europe, all US nuclear weapons from Europe, then we would have to step up. One, to reassure our allies and partners, because reassurance is as important as deterrence. And two, to make sure that Putin understands that if he attacked a NATO country, say Estonia, for instance, he may face, perhaps he would face, a nuclear threat from France. Mm-hmm. Now, this is not the situation we're in now. At present, I think that our neighbors, some of them, in particular Poland or the Baltic states, they need an additional reassurance from France. But they don't need a separate nuclear deterrence component. Finally, one important point on this debate. Sometimes people talk about the EU and nuclear weapons. The EU is irrelevant there, for two reasons. One, because the EU includes at least two countries which don't want to have to do anything with nuclear weapons. Austria, Ireland in particular. Some others don't like nuclear weapons too much anyway. But most importantly, because the UK is no longer a member. And if you have to play a new nuclear game in Europe, you have to factor in the UK. It's not about France, it's about the two nuclear power which exist in Europe. So, bottom line, there is a growing role potentially for French and British nuclear weapons in Europe for both reassurance and deterrence. But as long as the US remains, at least on paper, the nuclear guarantor of Europe, I don't think it's likely that we will see steps towards the creation of a European nuclear deterrent. Mm.
And beyond nuclear deterrence, but talking about integration of EU defense capabilities and all the discussion that this can be done within the European Union framework if the EU evolves into some sort of true geopolitical actor, or as a European pillar within NATO that still believes that NATO is the right organization on which to have these tasks executed. Where would you stand? What is the right formula at present in reinforcing these capabilities at the European level?
I think that by default, the NATO framework is the best one. Why? Because it exists. It's as simple as that. Because it includes the UK, it includes partners of Europe who will want to stay allied with Europe even if the US is no longer there. That is Canada, Norway, even Turkey. So I think the format by default of European defense, that is of Europe's ability to defend itself and cooperate accordingly, will remain NATO. If, under a scenario which does not exist today, but which could happen in 2 years from now, if the United States decided to withdraw from NATO, my suspicion, my very strong suspicion, or my intuition, is that the Europeans will want to use NATO without the United States. Now, don't get me wrong, this would be a revolution because we have not been used to think about our ability to defend ourselves without the United States since 1949. So it would be a revolution. But we would not want to create something new or transfer assets of NATO into the EU. So the EU will remain, I suspect, a secondary military actor. It doesn't mean that we're not doing important things in the EU. The fact that we've been using the peace facility, the fact that we are softening the criteria for public spending and public debt in order to be able to increase our national defense budget. All these are good and important. We are a security actor, but the ability of Europe to defend itself will continue to be dealt with primarily, I suspect, in NATO.
And of course, this heading to the last questions. This involves other aspects for which the EU is insufficiently equipped, and it's very difficult that at least in the short term or even medium term will be better equipped than it is today when it comes to intelligence, for instance, when it comes to logistics in the battlefield, when it comes to technology applied to warfare, and that includes artificial intelligence. In all those areas, really the EU might want to make a step forward, but it's very unlikely that it can substitute anything like what the United States is able to do today. Is that something, a goal we should pursue?
Look, there's one thing which is clear, is that we will not be a significant defense actor in 20 years if we don't make a significant investment together in technology, cyber, AI, without being completely dependent on the Americans, okay? So that investment, that's mostly civilian investment, is indispensable for the future of our defense sector. But it's precisely in this sector that we are still too dependent on the Americans. Don't get me wrong, I mean, I think we will still be able to cooperate with the Americans. We're still buying American because we can't produce everything in the tech business on European soil. But you mentioned intelligence. That's a very, very particular area, because that's really the one area that nations want to keep for themselves and don't want to put it in a collective basket. NATO intelligence is limited to tactical intelligence.
Sure.
NATO strategic intelligence does not exist. There's a bit of sharing, but the real business of intelligence sharing happens between countries which have developed mutual bonds of trust between each other. And the idea that we would create a super efficient European intelligence service which would replace national intelligence services, I think for me is either a dream or a nightmare, depending on your stand. But there are a few things where sovereignty is really important. National sovereignty is really important, remains very important. One is nuclear, the other is intelligence.
Even if the United States removes its, you mentioned that before, right? There's the prospect that one day the United States will say enough of the Europeans, right? We've seen that in Ukraine. I mean, the moment you withdraw the intelligence assistance of the Americans on the battlefield, then in this case, Ukraine has strong limitations to be operational, right? In its goals. That same thing could happen for Europeans if there are other fronts open. Do you see any prospects for, even at the national level, the capacity of Europeans to gather enough intelligence force for that end?
No, what I do see, I don't see any European ability to replace
European nor national within Europe, right?
European or national, collective or individual ability to replace the extraordinary intelligence apparatus of the United States. But we can do better individually, nationally, and we can do a little bit more also collectively when we, for instance, build observation satellites where we can share national time, for instance, time slots, time sharing. We can do that. But these projects are very difficult to embark in collective. That is, for instance, if we wanted to do a constellation of 10 super accurate military observation satellites, it would be very costly, of course, but it would be very difficult to have more than 2-3 countries building those satellites. So yes, that effort will have to be made, but let's not fool ourselves, let's not kid ourselves. We will not replace exactly American capabilities in this area, just like in others.
Fine, so we've reached the end of our conversation. It was a very stimulating discussion on all things related to conflict, war, intelligence, defense, all the multiple aspects that we covered. I would like to make a last question on visions for the future, if you had to put perspective onto everything that we've discussed, coming to 10 years, 15 years from now, 20 years from now, will we Europeans have been able to be brought back to a protagonist stance on everything that we've discussed? Are we envisioning a world that will go more in our favor or in our way of understanding global affairs, including our capabilities, or you see that the prospects are really doomed for us Europeans to take a step forward?
No, look, I'm rather optimistic about Europe because of the huge success, not only of the European projects of the first 50 years, but also, most importantly perhaps, by the fact that over the past 30 years, since the creation of the European Union, all the prophets of doom have been proven wrong. The scenarios of Europe exploding, of the European integration dissolving, etc., have been proven wrong. At each and every step, anytime there is a major crisis, migration, COVID, Euro, financial crisis, Ukraine, Europe ends up being a little stronger each time. So that makes me rather optimistic about the solidity of the European project, especially since now we are now at the third generation of European leaders since the creation of the European project. So I think that we can be proud of what we have achieved. I think it will be difficult, however, let's not hide the difficulties of becoming a major power on the par with the US, China, or even Russia, even though Russia is not very strong, is not a very strong economic power. So all in all, I have a balanced forecast. I'm rather bullish about the ability of Europe to thrive and survive. I'm not entirely optimistic about the ability of the EU to be a major power as such in the world of the mid-21st century.
All right, so thank you very much, Bruno Tertrais, for joining us in our conversations at CIDOB, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.